truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Friday, November 1st, 2024, the 1381st day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free version. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site in the show notes or by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. Let's get right into it with something we discussed earlier in the week, the choice by the Washington Post and other newspapers, but particularly the Washington Post, to abstain from endorsing a candidate in next week's fake election. The Trump-Vance campaign released this morning. Trump-Vance campaign files FEC complaint against the Kamala campaign. and the Washington Post. And it's interesting that they just call it the Kamala campaign, not the Harris campaign or the Kamala Harris campaign. Donald Trump, many times in his rallies, has mentioned that no one would know who they were talking about if he was saying Harris. The Trump-Vance campaign has filed an FEC complaint against the Washington Post for its illegal in-kind contributions to Harris for president. According to reports, the Post is using its advertising powers to promote pro-Kamala and anti-Trump coverage to voters in the final days of the election. While they declined to endorse her publicly, they have endorsed her in the dark. So much for democracy dies in darkness. The mainstream media has become nothing more than pro-Kamala propaganda. The Democrat machine must be held accountable. Now, the complaint is actually kind of interesting, so I want to go through at least some of it, because as we've discussed a number of times before the Trump-Biden debate, especially in an episode called Equal Time, and then often over the last month or so when it comes to Donald Trump and his criticisms of CBS, exactly how our media landscape is changing. And I think there might be some interplay with the way laws were 50 years ago in terms of things like the fairness doctrine. I wonder about the federal regulators, particularly in regard to these national news networks. These are not isolated incidents based on relatively minor complaints. These are all cover stories for what's going on in the background that are being used to highlight various parts of a problem so that people understand what is happening in a way that makes sense, that the public has a chance to vet for itself through the process of argument and discussion online and in person. This process is meant to guide us from that false reality layer back to that reality prime layer. And we need to understand these stories to be able to unwind each and every aspect that has been inverted in our lives and in our societal understanding, who we are and what all of that means. And so I think we're being presented with another aspect of the problem with mainstream media. So this is the complaint letter that was written at Harmeet Dillon's law practice. The Washington Post recently announced it would not endorse a political candidate, a decision the Post's owner defended on the basis that, quote, presidential endorsements do nothing to tip the scales of an election, end quote. Yet on October 30th, 2024, the news site Semaphore published a report titled Washington Post Pays to Boost Stories Critical of Trump as Subscribers Flee. The Semaphore article discloses that, starting on Monday, October 28th, just over a week before Election Day, the Washington Post has aggressively ramped up its paid advertising campaign, boosting dozens of articles related to the election. As Semaphore reported, this is no simple commercial marketing campaign. Quote, while the Post articles about Kamala Harris were relatively neutral in tone, end quote, if not flattering, quote, and focused on her digital strategy, her policy proposals, and her chances of winning, the articles that the Post paid to highlight about Trump told a different story, end quote. In fact, Semaphore reported, the Washington Post has paid to, quote, boost multiple critical articles, end quote, of President Trump through this sudden last-minute advertising campaign. So the claim here is that while they are writing articles that are neutral relative to Kamala Harris, what they are spending their advertisement money on is promoting anti-Trump content, which would suggest anti-Trump bias despite the neutrality of the articles. Now, their side of the argument would probably be we get more clicks from anti-Trump content. And so we push those posts because they're more likely to go viral. And it would be interesting to see whether or not that's true. Maybe we will someday. The heading of the next section is, there is reason to believe the Washington Post made and Harris for president accepted illegal in-kind corporate contributions. Under FECA, it is generally unlawful for corporations, quote, to make a contribution or expenditure in connection with any election to any political office or for any candidate, political committee, or other person knowingly to accept or receive any contribution, end quote. Coordinated communications are treated as an in-kind contribution to a candidate. A communication is coordinated when it is paid for by someone other than the campaign, satisfies at least one of the content standards, and satisfies at least one of the conduct standards. The advertisements in question were reportedly paid for by the Washington Post and thus satisfy the payment prong. As clarified by the Commission's recent Internet communication rulemaking, a communication that is, quote, placed or promoted for a fee on another person's website, end quote, is a public communication. Public communications that reference a clearly identified candidate for president within 120 days of an election satisfy the content prong. The Washington Post's communications reference clearly identified candidates for office, President Trump and Vice President Harris, are disseminated within 120 days of the 2024 presidential election and were promoted for a fee on the website of another. Accordingly, they satisfy the content prong. And this is very interesting because we have never heard about exactly this kind of election interference. We're having the spotlight shown on everything, or maybe it's more like a black light, so you can locate all the problems that aren't even visible to the naked eye. Now, maybe it's possible to maintain all of this system simply by knowing where all of these problems are and making sure each one is addressed, but it should also be a clue to the fact that there's something fundamentally wrong with the system because it has allowed the infiltration in this manner and in these ways that has happened in so many other countries. And the reason is the level of regime influence throughout this entire time. Let's continue. The conduct prong is satisfied when there is material involvement of the campaign in creation, production, or distribution of the communication, including regarding the content of the communication. In one of the reportedly promoted articles, the Harris campaign brags about how they, quote unquote, create the news. The reportedly promoted articles also include multiple quotes with Harris campaign officials, which confirm that there have been communications between the Washington Post and the Harris campaign. The content promoted by the Washington Post mirrors themes and issues highlighted by the Harris campaign. To wit, one of the promoted articles highlighted how the Harris digital team was pushing content on social media, claiming people were leaving President Trump's rallies early. A month later, the Washington Post published an article, which reportedly was boosted by the Post on the same topic with a similar editorial framing. A reasonable inference is that Harris's team has communicated its messaging strategy to the Washington Post, and that messaging strategy is reflected in what the Post chooses to promote. Put differently, the Post's own articles support a reasonable inference that the Harris team provided information about the content of communications that is material to the Washington Post's communications, providing reason to believe the conduct prong is satisfied. Thus, there is reason to believe the Washington Post has made coordinated communications which constitute illegal, corporate, in-kind contributions to Harris for President, and that Harris for President has accepted such contributions. I wonder if they knew this was coming at the beginning of the week. I mean, Jeff Bezos just wrote that amazing op-ed where he told us that the Washington Post understands no one really believes what they're saying. And because of that, they've gone to independent podcasters who don't do their research. And because of that, it's true that the country needs our mainstream media. We just need a mainstream media that is slightly better than this one. And therefore, the Washington Post is going to be just a little more to the right. We're going to call ourselves the independent news outlet where democracy dies in darkness. Oh no, democracy is going. Farewell, democracy. I heard you died in darkness, but the truth is you died as soon as there was sunlight. It's almost like democracy is a political vampire. But I shouldn't say democracy. It's really just your democracy. That's what you call it. Your democracy is a vampire. Your democracy dies in sunlight. Farewell, your democracy. The letter goes step by step through the legal argument. I would encourage everyone to read it. And you can get to the complaint through the press release at donaldjtrump.com. This is the conclusion. The facts support a reasonable inference that the Washington Post and Harris for President accepted an illegal corporate contribution in the form of coordinated communications. Therefore, the commission should find reason to believe a violation has occurred, conduct an immediate investigation, and assess an appropriate sanction for this corporate interference in our elections. In the alternative, the facts show that the Washington Post made an unreported independent expenditure. Therefore, the commission should find reason to believe a violation has occurred and assess an appropriate penalty for this infusion of dark money into the 2024 campaign. We will see how the FEC responds. I wouldn't hold out much hope, and I would hope that the FEC is on the chopping block. How about we just have no federal elections? We'll do it like the so-called anti-federalists wanted. We'll just have state delegates that serve for a year and can be recalled at any time whatsoever, and we will let them go cast votes on our behalf, or they will be recalled. Senators can be appointed or otherwise selected. We actually don't need federal elections at all. That's not anti-government. It's not even anti-constitution. It's basically just the Constitution, with a little bit of the Articles of Confederation mixed in. That was the first founding document after the Revolution. It's certainly not radical to suggest we at least take a look at it. CNN's boxer short-wearing potato Brian Stelter weighed in on the media this week. He said, anonymous TV executive, quote, if half the country has decided that Trump is qualified to be president, that means they're not reading any of this media, and we've lost this audience completely. A Trump victory means mainstream media is dead in its current form. And yes, in terms of a media that is trusted and respected, the mainstream media is dead and has no hopes of resuscitation. But I would disagree with him about his assessment that the public is not reading the mainstream media. The public is reading the mainstream media and listening to the mainstream media, and that's why they don't trust it anymore. It also provides an excellent roadmap for everything not to do and not to believe, and where we should look to find absolutely all of the weak spots. The propaganda they create is not random. They're not reacting to real events. They are creating a world for the same purpose all the time. And once you understand what they're trying to create and can read it in their articles and presentations, then all you hear is them telling you where to look by begging you not to look and calling you a conspiracy theorist if you do. I think the mainstream media should remain in this form, doing exactly this forever. I think the people just need to be a little more discerning. But that, of course, requires admitting that it all actually is bullshit. It's all fake. That's the point. They're lying on purpose. And when everyone knows they're lying about everything, then no one believes them. The point is not to prove that your brand is better than the other brand. They're both toxic sludge. The media is in the brand of false reality creation, as are the pollsters. This is the New York Post from this morning. Election guru Nate Silver accuses pollsters of putting finger on the scale, lying to keep presidential race close. Well, thanks, Nate. I believe you've just given the game away. Polls are just for narrative creation, which is reality creation. Polling guru Nate Silver lashed out at other survey junkies in his field for quote-unquote cheating in the final stretch of the 2024 presidential election, accusing them of recycling some results to keep the race between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris close. The 538 founder said irresponsible pollsters were hurting their numbers, as though the numbers they were shepherding are the sheep and not the people reading their polls. Irresponsible pollsters were herding their numbers or using past results to affect current ones, to keep Vice President Harris and former President Trump within a point or two of each other each time. I kind of trust pollsters less, Silver said on his podcast, name-checking Emerson College. They all, every time a pollster says, oh, every state is just +1. Every state's a tie. No, you're effing hurting. You're cheating. You're cheating, he fumed. Your numbers aren't all going to come out at exactly 1 point leads when you're sampling 800 people over dozens of surveys, Silver vented. You are lying. You are putting your effing finger on the scale. And wow, this dork has laser eyes. Silver's own vaunted model puts Trump ahead of Harris 55% to 45% as voters prepare to head to the polls in just 3 days. And all that means is that Trump has a 5 in 9 chance and Kamala has a 4 in 9 chance, according to Nate Silver. That also is not what Nate Silver's model shows right now. Right now, he has Trump winning 51 times out of 100 and Harris winning 48 times out of 100, with some chance of no electoral college winner. He also has the actual polling numbers right now, their aggregator, with Harris at 48% and Trump at 46.8%. So I don't know what the New York Post is referring to there. His scorn also extended to all these GOP-leaning firms, showing the president narrowly ahead each time to project that they're not going too far out on a limb. If a pollster never publishes any numbers that surprise you, then it has no value, he said. Silver blasted most other pollsters except for the New York Times, saying the rest were just effing punting on this election for the most part. And the New York Times Siena College poll is the #1 most credible poll on 538's site. So make of that what you will, and consider that in terms of whether or not you should take Nate Silver as a credible analyst here. But look, he says, all 7 swing states are still polling within, it looks like, 1.5 points here. It doesn't take a genius to know that if every swing state is a tie, that the overall forecast is a tie. Okay, but they're also not that. He goes on. In an election where the 7 battleground states are all polling within a percentage point or two, 50-50 is the only responsible forecast. Yet when I deliver this unsatisfying news, I inevitably get a question. Come on, Nate, what's your gut say? So, okay, I'll tell you. My gut says Donald Trump. And my guess is that it's true for many anxious Democrats. And you have to love that he knows the polls are biased, and he's certainly smart enough to know the polls are fake, but he's going to go ahead and analyze them anyway. It's almost like treating all of this as real, despite knowing it's not, is a requirement for a regime mouthpiece like Nate Silver, or anyone in mainstream media, or most of the podcast sphere. None of them have bothered at any point in the last 4 years trying to analyze what's happening through the lens and with the understanding that our elections are not real. And if they were, they would be rigged, manipulated, and stolen, which they definitely are. And you know what that makes them? Fake. If the people running the elections know they're fake, and the people running in the elections know they're fake, and the voters know they're fake, then what we have is a self-deceiving psyop that everyone is participating in that doesn't actually determine the direction of the country or who's leading it. But it is a necessary pagan ritual whereby we all agree to hand over all our power to the state. Everyone gets together and agrees to deceive themselves in order to anoint a new God King. And we obsess over it, spending far more time and energy and our spirit on who we get to grovel before. It really is all quite deranged. But hey, that's our democracy. Democracy thrives in darkness. Let's go to the New York Times. This is from yesterday. Why the right thinks Trump is running away with the race. Ah, yeah, that old crazy right. We all know it's a super, super close race. Just like Nate Silver said, it's tied in all the battlegrounds, and therefore it's tied overall. The torrent of polls began arriving just a few weeks ago, one after the other, most showing a victory for Donald J. Trump. They stood out amid the hundreds of others, indicating a dead heat in the presidential election. But they had something in common. They were commissioned by right-leaning groups with a vested interest in promoting Republican strength. Oh, wow. So the New York Times is agreeing that fake polls are totally possible. These surveys had a marginal, if any, impact on polling averages, which either do not include the partisan polls or give them little weight. Yet some argue that the real purpose of partisan polls, along with other expectation-setting metrics such as political betting markets, is directed at a different goal entirely: building a narrative of unstoppable momentum for Mr. Trump. Wow, what incisive reporting and insightful reporting from the New York Times. We've certainly discussed that principle on this show countless times. These are narrative devices because all that matters is the narrative. Now, they believe that the elections are real. All that matters in a real election is the narrative, because then the outcome would directly reflect the winner of the battle of narratives. But it is also true that knowing the elections are fake, and they are, then the only thing we have is the battle of narratives. And so it seems what they're upset about is that we figured that out. The partisan polls appear focused on lifting Republican enthusiasm before the election and, perhaps more important, cementing the idea that the only way Mr. Trump can lose to Vice President Kamala Harris is if the election is rigged. And that's exactly right. That is the only way he can lose. Polls promising a Republican victory, the theory runs, could be held up as evidence of cheating if that victory does not come to pass. No, that is not how the theory runs. Polls are fake. The narrative, though, is very real. The only way people will believe that narrative is if it maps onto the reality as they perceive it. The reality projected within the false reality by the media has collapsed. People no longer perceive their world that way, so the rest of the media story no longer maps onto their reality. There is no narrative whereby Kamala Harris could win that would map onto their reality. It is already narratively too big to rig, no matter how many of these excuses and justifications they try to find. They are trying to refute the obvious collective interpretation of reality as people are experiencing it, with Donald Trump at his most popular point ever, certainly far more popular than he was 4 years ago or 8 years ago. And they're attempting to refute it on the basis of polling that people know to be fake. Polling that is only supported by prior election results that people also know to be fake. Then they quote some academic expert and Twitter's own Ian Miles Chong. But let's continue. In the final stretch of the campaign in 2020, Republican-aligned pollsters released 15 presidential election polls of swing states. In the same period this year, they have released 37. According to the New York Times analysis of data from the polling aggregator 538. Of those 37, all but 7 had Mr. Trump in the lead. 30 whole polls say that and 7 don't? How is it even possible? That increase comes as the volume of nonpartisan polls, such as those commissioned by major news organizations, have dropped significantly, though they still make up the majority of the polls released. Of the nonpartisan surveys released in the final weeks of this year's campaign, roughly half showed a lead for Mr. Trump. And gosh, why are there fewer nonpartisan polls? I wonder if it's something about them portraying objectivity while just being fake news polls to support the Uniparty. And that is only counting polls that are explicitly designated as politically aligned by 538 again, which sets a high bar for defining partisan polls. Oh, I'm sure that they just put in the most exacting qualifications. Nate Silver, the expert's expert, who knows polls are fake and used for narrative building, but will still gladly analyze them as though that's not true. Other factors have fueled the perception of Mr. Trump's strength. Betting platforms like Polymarket and Kalshi that allow people to place bets on election outcomes have seen a spike in Mr. Trump's favor over the past month, one that does not track with the overall state of the race as captured by reputable polling firms. That surge appears to have been pushed almost entirely by a very small number of high-value bets from just 4 accounts linked to a French national. Those accounts have collectively placed $30 million on a Trump victory this month. Oh man, who was that guy who was saying for the entire time that those betting market numbers are also bullshit? Oh wait, sorry, that was me. Mr. Trump and his allies have nonetheless promoted the betting markets, although they are opaque, largely unregulated, and not a scientific way to gauge public polls. Who would have ever thought otherwise? Mr. Trump cited Polymarket in a recent speech saying, "I don't know what the hell it means, but it means we're doing pretty well." A spokesperson for Polymarket declined to comment for the article. Skipping ahead. Overall, Mr. Trump has made slight gains in the national polling average over the past 2 weeks, and the battleground state polling averages have tightened. Still, the race remains uncommonly close. This has not stopped these polls from shaping the broader narrative in the race's final stretch. The averages on the popular aggregation site Real Clear Politics in particular are widely cited on social media and similarly irrelevant. Unlike its competitors, Real Clear Politics does not filter out low-quality polls, incorporating results from pollsters with a poor track record that other aggregators reject. These pollsters are not allowed to play reindeer games. You got like Mark Mitchell from Rasmussen and Robert Cahaley from Trafalgar sitting in a corner crying together. Always rejected by the other aggregators, but not by Real Clear Politics. And what does that do? That convinces conservatives that, well, Real Clear Politics really is fair and balanced. That's the one-stop shop for knowing this is a very close race, no matter what happens. Their no toss-ups map currently shows Mr. Trump winning every single swing state. So it's a very close race, but Donald Trump might even be favored to win that very close race in a way that makes it not look very close. The article notes that early voting data, a fickle predictive metric, has also been cited by Trump supporters as further evidence of his impending triumph. Now, there shouldn't be all of this early voting data, but there is, and we're told it's just demographic data. It's just broken down by men and women, or by age, or by college education, or by race. All we have is the demographic information. We don't know exactly who voted, except the people passing along that demographic information do know exactly who voted. And of course they do, because they know all of that demographic information and, of course, party affiliations, which we are told is how they can predict to some reasonable degree who's ahead based on the early voting numbers, and then they adjust their strategies accordingly. Now, we're not just getting the raw data, so there is a much bigger data set up there, which means they have a lot more information than what we're being told, but we are already being told far too much information. If you're going to give us that information, well, then just tell us the score and allow us to track the whole thing in a way that will be accountable. But we can't have that, so we get secrecy sleeves and pretend that no one actually knows. Maybe if we really press them, they'll tell us, okay, well, it's entirely possible for them to know, obviously, because they've scanned all these already. But nobody looks. We don't actually count or publish these numbers. So, yes, they are known, but no one actually knows them. Okay, commies, we'll just take your word for it. Your election system has never let us down. We have this strange new push by some Con Inc. influencers and DeSantis simps, sometimes Trumpers like Mike Cernovich. He's the guy who navigates his position to what he believes is a perfect middle, where he can make both sides just a little mad at him, making him seem extra edgy and extra smart. He always tells everybody how smart he is and calls everyone else a low IQ person. He's also made some great videos advertising COVID masks and vaccines. He ignores the fact that our elections are stolen and our polls are fake, and he's one of those guys that has said on numerous occasions, Trump is done. He's one of those people who thinks he's much smarter and stronger than Trump and so much better informed about what's going on that he should be telling Donald Trump what's happening, and Trump should just be listening to him. Here's a post he made yesterday on X, formerly Twitter. And actually, before we do that, let's go to a post of his from a couple of months ago. He said, X is by far the most civilized platform. Everyone bitches about Elon allowing free speech, but they don't go elsewhere. My Facebook page had 400K. I left many years ago, more on Central. Instagram is full of prostitution reels. TikTok is dumb skits. Everyone is smart on X. Everyone is smart on X. And of course, Mike Cernovich, one of the smartest on X. X, of course, is actually the intellectual kids table. It is a censored platform. There are ideas that are completely barred from the main public conversation, thus allowing people like Mike Cernovich to seem really smart. And if you think I'm being too harsh, here's the post from yesterday. Women are voting early, outperforming men. The current MAGA cope is men vote on election days. Not in 2022, they didn't. Especially not young men who listen to podcasts like Joe Rogan. They don't vote. Get them to this time. So you see that the 2022 midterms, they were real. And that was MAGA's fault, Donald Trump's fault, that the red wave never materialized. Nothing to do with the election fraud. We, MAGA, are responsible for losing in 2022. Men don't get out and vote enough in our fake elections. This is a very close election. So if we lose, it's going to be the fault of men because MAGA, they don't do their job by going to vote. You know who does? Those establishment conservatives. They always show up and vote for Republicans, even if they don't like the candidate, like Donald Trump. They're going to come out and support him anyway. That's how good they are. Cernovich, who, like I said, is sometimes Trump, has been letting people on Twitter know how long he's been in this game for, how it was when the real ones were at work in 2015, as though he's devoted his whole life to this or something. He also put this up a couple days ago. I got 4 kids. This election is real to me. It's entertainment for far too many of you. Unfortunately, that will not last. You think it's spectacle. It's going to get real bad if Kamala takes power. Roving gangs of criminals. You won't find it funny. Oh, yeah, threaten us, Maskey. We are so scared. Charlie Kirk said on Wednesday, early vote has been disproportionately female. If men stay at home, Kamala is president. It's that simple. If you want a vision of the future, if you don't vote, imagine Kamala's voice cackling forever. Men need to, all caps, go vote now. So are these guys telling the truth? Are they analyzing the early voting data as it comes in, assuming all that early voting data is real and true? Or is this just an info op? And it might be a good info op or a bad info op. It would be hilarious to watch the regime suggest that Trump lost because the men stayed home. No one would believe that in a million years because it's ridiculous. But it might not be too ridiculous for people like Mike Cernovich and Charlie Kirk. What are we supposed to take from the fact that they go along with the elections as though they are real time after time, and they go along with the idea that the elections are close races despite knowing that the polls are fake? It's possible that they're running some brilliant info op that helps Trump in every way, but it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like they're creating possible scenarios to blame MAGA for any underperformance they can describe. Do their rhino candidates lose in this state or that state? Blame MAGA. But of course, it's not only MAGA. They're also preparing narratives, and I'm not talking about these two in particular, but narratives are being prepared to blame Christians. And then, of course, it will also be narratives to blame election deniers. The election deniers caused people to stay home and not participate in the fake election. And so they're really to blame. And who are the election deniers? Well, they're in MAGA. And now all of a sudden you've got an angle, particularly if you have the mainstream media delegitimizing Trump in the event of a close Trump, quote unquote, victory reported by the television. They begin to delegitimize Trump, attempt to disqualify him, potentially at the state level, but otherwise by objecting to electors. And if they disqualify Trump, who's left? That doesn't overturn the result of the election because we're only voting for electors in the first place. We're not actually directly voting for Donald Trump. So all that would happen over the course of that 2.5 months would be that Donald Trump is disqualified. He can't take office as president. But hey, at least everybody loves J.D. Vance. I mean, right? All the television characters, they can't get enough of J.D. Vance. The podcasters and the very, very conservative, very serious intellectual influencers over there on X, formerly Twitter, Like Mike Cernovich, they know J.D. Vance is the best. He's going to wake up the normies. And they don't really care about waking up the normies. They just want political power. But they know their audience and their followers are all normies. And they know the normies like to hear affirmations of everything they already believe. And that's exactly what J.D. Vance is an expert at giving them. For whatever reason, J.D. Vance appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast. That episode was released yesterday. It's about 3 hours and 20 minutes long. I made it through about 80 minutes so far. I'm going to listen to the rest. Some of it is fairly interesting, and some of it is totally inauthentic, like most of what J.D. Vance does. I don't know if you've ever read his book. You could listen to the audiobook. It's not authentic. I would strongly doubt that he wrote it. And people get very triggered by this. Why? Am I going to cost them the fake election? Someone's going to get mad at what I say about J.D. Vance and then not vote for Donald Trump? It doesn't even make sense. It's not like we know J.D. Vance is a committed MAGA warrior for all time or anything. And if that's not who and what he is, then replacing Donald Trump, removing him so that Vance would be elevated, would be the number one goal and priority of the uniparty right establishment. It actually is worth it to be looking out for that possibility rather than just supplicating and groveling before our next anointed God King. Oh, he's going to be president in 2028. Someday he will be our ruler. It's like the Lannisters' servants in Game of Thrones, just waiting to serve King Joffrey. Donald Trump goes on the most popular podcast in the world, does 3 hours, knocks it out of the park, and then a few days later, the running mate goes on the same show after him. It immediately reminded me of when at Donald Trump's Butler rally a few weeks back, when the opera singer was creating amazing music for the crowd, J.D. Vance was conducting a live-streamed interview, ignoring that wonderful performance that Trump put on, so he could make the same points that all these people make on podcasts. We don't need to pretend these people are immediately our best friends and greatest allies because Trump has shined a spotlight on a person for 2 or 3 months, or hey, who knows, maybe much longer. And it's not like I hate the guy, he just hasn't proven anything. There is also a well-organized media effort by people who have been strongly anti-Trump at various times or for a very long time to constantly advise and critique and diminish Donald Trump while glorifying J.D. Vance in every way they can. A bunch of those people were out last weekend after Donald Trump's appearance on Rogan, talking about how Donald Trump didn't do enough to make his case that the 2020 election was stolen. He didn't bring the receipts in the way they demanded. What an opportunity he missed. Well, where is that critique for J.D. Vance? Donald Trump actually did talk about it and made the points. J.D. Vance didn't talk about it much at all. Why aren't all of those Trump critics out there criticizing J.D. Vance in the same way? And for that matter, why aren't they posting all these clips of J.D. Vance? Why isn't his Rogan interview going viral at all? It's because it doesn't really matter. The case was already made by the genuine article. We don't need the backup. If Tom Brady puts the Patriots up by 6 touchdowns, you don't stick around and watch the last 10 minutes of the fourth quarter to watch the backup quarterback hand it off. We all agree that perception is manipulated for a purpose. The purpose perception is being manipulated to serve right now is not votes in a real election on Tuesday. It's for what comes after. Let's pick it up toward the end. Yet even a slight shift in perception could be enough to fuel claims of a stolen election if Mr. Trump loses, claims the former president and his supporters have already been teeing up. We need to make it too big to rig, Mr. Trump posted on social media on Tuesday, an exhortation that some say underscores the real strategy to make a loss seem mathematically impossible. Of course, the loss is mathematically impossible. It also doesn't make sense because this is a fake election. Trump won in 2020. He never conceded. Joe Biden was not legitimately certified. Joe Biden was not legitimately inaugurated. And Joe Biden is not in any meaningful way the president of the United States of America. The main reason you float data like that is because you're trying to convince your supporters there's no way Trump can lose unless it's stolen. said Mike Madrid, a longtime Republican strategist who is critical of the former president. The goal is to set the predicate for the race's aftermath so you can challenge the result. Well, no, that's not necessary. All that matters is the court of public opinion. Concerning ourselves with challenging the result means that we accept the result as being a real one in the first place that needs challenging. It's not a real result in the first place, no matter who comes out ahead. We have been given no reason, no argument, no justification to believe otherwise, including from Trump. Too big to rig does not make that argument. And in the meantime, he has pointed out instance after instance after instance after instance of election interference, election malfeasance and manipulation, election fraud, election rigging. Whatever words you want to use to describe whatever aspect you want to describe, Donald Trump has been highlighting all of them. The polls the New York Times is claiming are good for Donald Trump are not good for Donald Trump. They're good for the people who want to perpetuate the bullshit narrative that this is a close race. It is nowhere close. Joe Biden did not receive 81 million real, lawful American votes. And Donald Trump's popularity has grown in astronomical ways for 4 straight years. And that's with the very violent insurrection, with the propaganda and censorship, with the indictments, with all of it. Despite all of that, Donald Trump is more popular now than he ever was, ever. Joe Biden did not receive 81 million real lawful American votes. There is absolutely no way in the world that Donald Trump is not winning by enormous margins. In reality, these people are propping up the false reality of polling being real, the false reality of this race being close. The elections are not real. Any analysis suggesting otherwise is already on its face bad analysis. But sure, all of this is just so the result can be challenged. That opinion is shared by a growing faction on both sides of the aisle who are dismayed to see polls weaponized in a way that could undermine faith in the entire system. That's my main concern, said Adam Carlson, a data analyst and former Democrat pollster who has been tracking the partisan polls. People will believe what they want to believe on both sides, but only on one side does that have the chance to lead to pervasive election denial. Well, first off, Adam, that's not true at all. If Donald Trump won in the way he would win if we had real elections, the other side would be experiencing pervasive election denial because they have been told that Joe Biden was close and that Kamala Harris is close. The reality would break their little commie brains, and I imagine we will still see that happen. Democrats have also tried to use the partisan polls and stacked betting odds to increase their chances, figuring that playing from behind could help turnout and pull a bit more cash from donors' pockets. Oh, the Democrats are making it look good for Trump because they think it'll be better for their pockets and their turnout. How about that? The polls are real, except when they suggest Trump is definitely ahead and then they're fake. And the reason they're fake is because the Democrats are influencing them to make it look like Donald Trump's ahead for profit and turnout. It's really going to make them win by so much more. Dozens of fundraising emails from the Harris campaign in recent weeks have promoted polls showing Mr. Trump ahead in battleground states and in the national average. One from this week called the data deeply concerning as it implored voters to donate $10. And by the way, yesterday I was sent a Kamala Harris text message that says, begging on my hands and knees, we need one more gift to boost voter turnout for Kamala. Now, is that a real Kamala Harris campaign message? There's no way of knowing. It might just be a phishing message. But I thought their message about Kamala Harris begging on her hands and knees was, let's say, evocative. Let's close out this article. Others on the left believe that even the polling averages are skewed in Mr. Trump's favor and that Ms. Harris is actually poised for a surprise landslide in much the same way that Democrats overperformed expectations in the midterms. Ah, yes, it's all real. John Anzalone, who was President Biden's chief pollster in 2020 and still conducts internal polls for Democrats, gave his advice for the election's final stretch. Ignore the noise. Of course, people don't know what to make about the public polls, he said. there's a ton of garbage polls, but some of them are totally real. And to know which ones, we need to ask Nate Silver, who knows that they're all totally fake, but will analyze them as though they're not, so that they can guide you. Now, we've been talking quite a bit over the past few weeks about these issues surrounding the presidential transition and how the Trump team isn't really participating in the process the way the administrative state expects them to. This is from the Associated Press on Wednesday. New law makes dueling presidential transitions possible. There will be 77 days between Election Day and inauguration, a period in which the president-elect may ready his or her administration to take over power from President Joe Biden. Long built on tradition and bipartisanship, the presidential transition exploded into a point of political contention 4 years ago after then-President Donald Trump made baseless claims to dispute his loss, and his administration delayed kicking off the transition process for weeks. None of that paragraph was true. First of all, tradition and bipartisanship really just means the uniparty and the standards the uniparty has adhered to, because the two sides of it work together to accomplish the same goals. So why not pretend there's just a tradition of working together? And it wasn't 4 years ago that the presidential transition turned into a point of contention. It was in the 2016-2017 transition, when Donald Trump was the target of an ongoing coup that started before he won and continued throughout his first term. Donald Trump may have delayed the transition process relative to what they wanted, but it wasn't any sort of violation of the Constitution or the law. This year, a new law is meant to start the transition sooner, no matter who wins. But if neither major party candidate concedes after Election Day, the updated rules allow both sides to get additional government funding and logistical support to begin working toward transitioning to power. That could lead to both Vice President Kamala Harris and Trump potentially assembling dueling governments in waiting for weeks. Oh, wow. And what if they don't decide who's going to take over? Or what if the TV just doesn't tell us that Donald Trump actually has a dueling government? What if they just say Kamala Harris is the president now and Donald Trump is just still pretending to do things down in Mar-a-Lago and Bedminster the way he was from 2021 to 2025? Dueling governments in waiting. That is the phrase of the Associated Press. Not of me, but of the regime mouthpiece, the AP. The AP sets out the article as a look at how changes meant to fix the problems of 4 years ago may not solve coming issues this time, and where the coming transition stands in the meantime. What happened in 2020? Trump lied about widespread voter fraud that didn't occur, delaying the start of the 2020 transition from one administration to the next, from Election Day on November 3rd to November 23rd. And that's a little shocking, because on Election Day, Donald Trump actually won the election. Remember that? How he was up by 800,000 votes in Pennsylvania when they stopped counting, and then just magically the next morning, Joe Biden won with like 90% Joe Biden votes coming in overnight, and everyone just said, oh yeah, I guess Joe Biden won. We knew that it was just going to be a red mirage. That's just the mail-in ballots coming in. People really just pretended that was true. The AP is still pretending it's true. The Trump-appointed head of the General Services Administration, Emily Murphy, consulted the transition law dating to 1963 and determined that she had no legal standing to determine a winner and start funding and cooperating with a transition to a Biden administration because Trump was still challenging the results in court. And that is absolutely sensible, reasonable, rational. That is her responsibility as a public servant to follow the law. There's nothing that gives her the responsibility of choosing that, yes, the television is correct, that Joe Biden really did receive 81 million real lawful American votes. GSA essentially acts as the federal government's landlord, and it wasn't until Trump's efforts to subvert free and fair election results had collapsed across key states that Murphy agreed to formally ascertain a president-elect. And no, That's not what it was, commies, because those efforts have never stopped and they have never failed. They did not collapse. We just watched certain courts refuse to test the evidence for whatever reason, because they were not allowed to in some way or because they're corrupted. The AP notes that Trump also eventually posted on social media that his administration would cooperate. Enacted in December 2022, the Presidential Transition Improvement Act now mandates that the transition process begin 5 days after the election, even if more than one candidate hasn't conceded. How about that? It's like they're expecting that. Will it matter from Trump? Of course not. Why would he concede? It's not even a real election. That avoids long delays and means that, quote, an affirmative ascertainment by the GSA is no longer a prerequisite for gaining transition support services, according to agency guidelines on the new rules. But the new law also effectively mandates federal support and cooperation for both candidates to begin a transition. It states that such support should continue until, quote unquote, significant legal challenges that could alter electoral outcomes have been, quote unquote, substantially resolved, or when electors from each state meet in December to formally choose an electoral college winner. Now, Trump isn't engaged in any kind of transition process, with the illegitimate Biden administration operating the false reality layer of our federal government, if indeed one of those still exists. So basically, all of this is there to allow Kamala Harris to go through the transition despite not having ever won any election and not even having won a primary. Isn't that going to be amazing? Your quote unquote president could be someone no one ever voted for. How could they do that to us? Well, I don't know, but they have all the power, so we're just going to grovel forever. That means the government potentially bestowing enough backing that both sides can prepare an administration until mid-December, only about a month before Inauguration Day on January 20th. My, I guess we're going to see this play out, aren't we? The advantage, according to a law professor at Notre Dame, is that it ensures that potentially two candidates get backing for transitions, with one eventually falling away. He said that's preferable to having a situation where no transition support is released to either side, which can spark delays leading to national security lapses. So Kamala Harris is going to need to keep getting information from the government in order to prevent national security lapses. We wouldn't want Kamala to go in unprepared. It sounds to me like they are setting up another one of those situations where they demand information that they are being prevented access to getting. We have covered multiple times the transition process and the fact that the Trump team is not engaging, so we can skip that section and we'll come right down here close to the end. What will the transition look like? Neither side will be starting totally from scratch. While Harris will build her own government, she might tap some holdovers from the Biden administration, where she was vice president. Sure she was, guys. Trump will bring in a new team, but he built an entirely new administration in 2017 and can do it again. Harris could also opt to keep Senate-confirmed Biden appointees as acting cabinet secretaries. Oh, how about that? She's just going to transition the Biden cabinet, and then Pete Buttigieg will be her transportation secretary as well. That'll make the whole government feel real. Trying to actually confirm cabinet members would make the government feel real fake. She's promised to appoint a Republican to her cabinet, with an early favorite being former Wyoming Representative Liz Cheney, once the third-ranking member of the House GOP and the daughter of a Republican vice president who has campaigned with Harris. And oh yes, please make Liz Cheney the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, or maybe the Secretary of Defense. I mean, if people are begging for the hose, we might as well just get the hose. I am a proponent of acceleration. Show us how bad it actually can be and let the people respond. And we will return to Liz Cheney before this show is out. Trump said he may tap former independent presidential hopeful and anti-vaccination activist Robert Kennedy Jr. on health issues and make South African-born Elon Musk a Secretary of Federal, quote-unquote, cost cutting. Either way, John Kirby, Biden's national security spokesman, said the current administration is set for a proper transition, quote, no matter how things play out in the election. Oh, wow. You're just going to do the same transition no matter what, huh? And you're going to do it for both parties, will ya? Is that what's happening? You're setting up two parallel governments in waiting? Oh, I can't wait to see if we have another fake president again. Then we'll really be just like Venezuela, and of course, we already are. Actually, it's possible that Venezuela is well ahead of us. And it's funny that that idea triggers so many people. They're like, what are you talking about? Venezuela's communist. They're eating the dogs and they're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there. Oh, no, wait. Oh, no, that's Ohio. Venezuela is that place where the regime tried to steal the election and tried to announce to the world the election was stolen and actually got all of their Commonwealth and regime colonies to go along with what they reported to be the results of that stolen election, and neither Venezuela nor their leader went along with it. But sure, they're the totally brainwashed, backwards, communist country. Our fake president, who was not elected, the guy who starts those fake foreign proxy wars and gives away all our money and opens our border and tries to force us into medical experiments and targets a hate movement at us, that's not the authoritarian communist dictator. It's Nicolas Maduro. Now, I would be remiss on the last Friday episode before the greatest election of all time to not provide you with a wonderful piece of elite panic. I feel as though I am some connoisseur of that phenomenon, and on Fridays, I like to share in that enjoyment. So please let me serve as your sommelier. This is the New York Times. The writer is Michelle Goldberg, and the headline is, What to Expect When You're Expecting Fascism. Lately, I've seen conservatives taunting liberals online by asking if we really think America could be on the verge of fascism, why our bags aren't packed. It's tempting to begin trolling my anti-Trump friends by asking if they are liquefying assets, getting passports in order, etc., says Scott McConnell, a founding editor of the American Conservative. He posted it on X, formerly Twitter. National Review's Michael Brendan Doherty said something similarly snarky. So fascism is here and you're not doing what people did when fascism showed up, which is contemplating emigration in terror or joining armed resistance. And that is one interesting version of history. I'm not exactly sure it's the right one. And it's important to remember that as an opinion columnist at the New York Times, Michelle Goldberg is an elite. And she channels the little people and lets us know that her personal fears are actually the fears of all those little people that we need to be looking out for. These jabs seem meant to mock the dread many of us are living in. But despite their bad faith, they've lodged in my mind, especially during the late night insomniac hours when I'm up panicking about what's going to happen on Tuesday. They've goaded me to think through what I truly expect to happen if an unconstrained Donald Trump retakes power and what it would mean to raise children in a country sick enough to give it to him. Oh, no. Many people I know who have the privilege to do so are in fact making contingency plans. Friends whose family histories entitle them to European passports have secured them. Well, wait a second, Michelle. What about your friends whose histories entitle them to Israeli passports? Are they doing that too? Or is it just the Europeans? But while I'm having lots of half-idle conversations about emigration, I'm not living my life as if either tyranny or exile is imminent, even though I believe, in keeping with assessments by prominent generals who've worked closely with Trump, that he's a fascist. Oh, yes, Michelle Goldberg. You're relying on those generals. Two people said that something is true, and that is a conclusive case. especially if you totally ignore the definition of fascism or anything Donald Trump has ever done. And you don't just have to ignore the real definition of fascism, you can also ignore the definition that people like Michelle Goldberg use. Partly, I just feel frozen with horror. This awful liminal period is like waiting for the results of a biopsy, and it's hard to reason clearly about the future until there's a prognosis. Beyond that, a lesson of modern autocracy is that ordinary life, or at least a diminished version of it, can go on even as democratic hopes are slowly strangled. Well, don't worry, Michelle. If the worst comes to pass, then you just go hide in the darkness, because that is where democracy thrives. Your democracy thrives in darkness. My single biggest fear about a Trump restoration is that he keeps his promise to carry out the largest domestic deportation operation in American history. As the New York Times has reported, that would mean sending ICE to carry out workplace raids and other sweeps in public places aimed at arresting scores of unauthorized immigrants at once and warehousing them in a network of newly built prison camps. Well, Michelle Goldberg, that certainly sounds like a sad and sorry story, and we can hope that process plays out as humanely as possible. It will certainly play out more humanely than the process by which all of these people were actually brought here. And for many of them, the lives they have experienced while they are here. But here's the thing. It wasn't the American people that decided to bring them here. It wasn't the MAGA extremists who decided to bring them here. That was the global regime. That was the people who run the international global slave trade, the NGOs and the cartels that facilitate it, and the governments and organizations that profit from it. If this happens, there will almost certainly be large protests. Will there? I really doubt there will, Michelle Goldberg, because most of the country wants that to happen, and the people who don't want it to happen are predominantly just checked out good Germans. They don't care. They're not paying attention. They will go along with whatever life is like one way or the other. There may be a small percentage of people who will protest, just as they did during the Summer of Love, although probably many fewer than that. They'll attempt to drum up a protest movement to cover for the violence, the domestic terrorism from BLM, Antifa, or whatever similar organizations they prop up in their place. But without the propaganda and the censorship turned up to the same degree, it's going to be a lot harder to pull that off. And when they break out, the protests, that is, it is not far-fetched to think Trump would order the military to violently suppress them. The generals, now warning about a second Trump term, say he wanted to do just that in the past. Does Michelle Goldberg believe that the American people would not want the National Guard to stop what we saw in 2020? What Michelle Goldberg wants is a rerun of the Maidan Square massacre. She wants protesters to be killed because that is a point of escalation in the color revolution playbook. She goes on. That is what I envision when I think of MAGA fascism. People demonized as vermin being dragged off to camps while dissent is violently crushed by the armed forces. I don't know how anyone who has listened to Trump and those around him can dismiss this scenario as hysterical. Well, that's because you talk to retarded people like yourself, Michelle Goldberg, or people who are lying, all of them communists, propagandists, and people who believe communist propaganda. Are we really to believe that Michelle Goldberg is just panicking on behalf of illegal aliens, worried that they're going to be mistreated? What would ever suggest her heart is this big? Now, by the way, if you go to Michelle Goldberg's bio page on the New York Times website, you will see Michelle Goldberg have to disclose a potential conflict of interest. She says, I should note that the company my husband works for is consulting on the Harris Walz campaign's organizing program. As far as her concern for the little people of society goes, she was quite concerned back in August of 2021, where she published articles with the headlines, COVID vaccines for kids can't wait, and the intolerable wait for a kid's vaccine. So if there's one thing Michelle Goldberg cares about, it's looking out for the little people. And if there's another one, it's abortion. And if there's another one, it's QAnon. And if there's another one after that, it's Zionism. And again, it's not me saying this. Look at her columns. Now, she describes herself as a secular Jew, but she is still committed to the Zionist cause, probably because she's looking out for all those little people who atrocities would be carried out against, though they are not her. She's basically claiming that she is deathly afraid of atrocity stories, so she just doesn't like horror movies. She actually also has a column from 2015 where she wrote, "I was a proud non-breeder, but then I changed my mind." Happy about her decision to have children, and that's why she knows that everyone else's children need the COVID vaccine, even though children didn't get it and didn't die from it. But they did die from the vaccine. One might call that sort of forced medical experimentation that at best people were propagandized into some kind of atrocity. In fact, that's what they called it when the people Michelle Goldberg is ultimately afraid of, the Nazis, did the exact same thing in conjunction with some of the same pharmaceutical companies. Does Michelle Goldberg know what side she's on? It doesn't seem like it. There will, I assume, be persecutions of Trump's more high-profile enemies. We know that Trump in his first term harangued Attorney General Jeff Sessions to prosecute Hillary Clinton. And the ex-president and his allies have been clear about their intention to end the independence of the Justice Department. Well, A, he didn't prosecute Hillary Clinton. So you knowing that he harangued Jeff Sessions is irrelevant, and the Justice Department is not now and never has been independent. Donald Trump is going to use it to go after criminals instead of his political opponents. Mitt Romney is taking seriously the possibility that Trump will use the government to go after him, telling The Atlantic's McKay Coppins, who, by the way, wrote an entire book glorifying Mitt Romney, "I think he has shown by his prior actions that you can take him at his word." This meaning Trump. Trump hasn't threatened Mitt Romney. What is Mitt so scared about? General Mark Milley, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff under Trump and President Biden until he retired last year, told the journalist Bob Woodward that he fears Trump could have him recalled to duty and court-martialed for disloyalty. Anyone significant enough to threaten Trump could find themselves targeted. Oh, that's interesting. Military tribunals? And it won't be only the powerful who need fear attacks by the MAGA state. Just look at those who found themselves in the crosshairs of America First Legal, an organization headed by the former Trump aide Stephen Miller, which the New York Times called a policy harbinger for a second Trump term. It has sued charities that help women pay for abortions, Maryland schools that expose children to radical gender ideology, and woke corporations, including the NFL, trying to increase diversity. Yet those are good things to go after legally. Michelle Goldberg is angry that people are filing lawsuits that might prove the illegality, the unconstitutionality, the criminality of what people on her side are doing. These people are in such a tiny bubble between the people at the New York Times and their audience. They must actually believe that they are speaking to some majority somehow. In a second Trump term, Miller and his allies will be able to deploy the power of the agencies, including the Justice Department, the Department of Education, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission against their foes. What? You mean by cutting their funding? How's the Department of Education going to be used against anyone's foes? They're just going to strip all the money from all these commie schools all across the country. That's not an atrocity. That's not being targeted by an authoritarian dictator. Her pro-vaccine counterparts were encouraging the segregation of the unvaccinated, and that children should be taken from their parents if their parents refuse to vaccinate. In terms of using the agencies to go after opponents, she writes, often, of course, they won't have to. We're already seeing troubling signs that some plutocrats are obeying in advance. The Washington Post's decision to quash its editorial board's endorsement of Kamala Harris shocked so many of the paper's readers because it seemed, despite the Post owner Jeff Bezos' insistence to the contrary, like an act of corrupt capitulation. And man, Michelle Goldberg, that seems like a baseless claim. The authoritative voice in this situation on what Jeff Bezos' motivations is Jeff Bezos. And he says that's not what his motivation is. Why aren't you trusting the experts? As the Post itself reported, Bezos' companies have billions of dollars in government contracts at stake. And during the last Trump administration, the president went out of his way to punish the billionaire for Post coverage he didn't like. In 2019, the Post reported Mark Short, then Mike Pence's chief of staff, told leaders of Bezos' space exploration company, "You have a Washington Post problem." The transition from democracy to autocracy is a process, not an on-off switch. By the end of Trump's first term, when the president was pressuring state officials to change vote totals, no. Staffing the highest levels of government with thugs and lackeys, no. And eventually sicking a vigilante mob on the Capitol, no. We'd already gone farther on the path to authoritarianism than I'd once thought possible. The place we left off at in January 2021 will, in all likelihood, be the starting point for a Trump administration in 2025. Her evidence that Trump is an extreme authoritarian are some things that she and her colleagues made up. Johnny McEntee, who started as Trump's bag carrier, had by the end of Trump's presidency become so powerful that some referred to him as the deputy president. As The Atlantic reported, he turned the Presidential Personnel Office, an agency in charge of hiring and firing political appointees, into an internal police force, obsessively monitoring administration officials for any sign of dissent, purging those who were deemed insufficiently devoted to Trump and frightening others into silence. Oh, The Atlantic reported that, did they? Is that outlet that reported the suckers and losers hoax? Is that outlet that just reported that Donald Trump was a Nazi? They reported that Donald Trump might consider firing people who weren't properly loyal to him. Maybe it's people who aren't properly loyal to the country, who aren't properly implementing the president's agenda that the president has every right to pursue as president under the law, under the Constitution. Maybe he didn't find it appropriate that all sorts of other rules and laws and traditions were put in place that protected the unaccountable bureaucratic state from proper oversight of the executive branch, the president who runs the executive branch, having the ability to fire bad actors stripped from him. It's almost like the intent was to create a corrupt and unaccountable bureaucratic state. Now a leader of Project 2025, honestly, these people. Now a leader of Project 2025, McEntee will most likely have a major role in staffing a new Trump White House. He recently called, with the kidding not kidding sneer common to MAGA, for scrapping the 19th Amendment, the one giving women the right to vote. Oh no, how could he joke about such a thing? Days out from the election, pointing out the potential nightmares ahead feels like screaming into a void. Yes, Michelle, because no one believes you, and because you're a lunatic. Trump's deep contempt for liberal democracy is, as they say, baked in. Well, it's really just contempt for your democracy, Michelle Goldberg, which is not actually a democracy. When Milley called Trump fascist to the core, and when John Kelly, a former Trump chief of staff, said that he wanted to rule as a dictator, the political debate wasn't about whether they were correct, but about whether their words would matter. Well, no, again, Michelle Goldberg, that's not what the debate was. You're just confused because you and your pals have made certain that the other side of the actual debate is never presented in the public conversation. Those of us who have been banned from that conversation and who still remain censored would be more than happy to make that argument. We just don't get to. The consensus seemed to be no. So those of us who recognize what Trump is lurch forward to Tuesday, a coin flip away from losing what we thought was our democratic birthright, trying and often failing to think through the aftermath of the unthinkable. And this is, again, a person who is concerned in this very article that the illegal aliens who were brought here in a global slave trade so they could be exploited for their labor and their political power deserve some portion of Americans' actual birthright. But even if the unthinkable happens, it won't happen all at once. Hannah Arendt wrote in The Origins of Totalitarianism about how the dislocations of World War I created a mass of stateless people who lived, quote, outside the pale of the law. Seeing these people deprived of human rights, those secure in their citizenship did not generally worry about their own. It was precisely the seeming stability of the surrounding world that made each group forced out of its protective boundaries look like an unfortunate exception to an otherwise sane and normal rule, wrote Arendt. My kids keep asking anxiously what will happen if Trump wins. I tell them that their lives won't change, that we'll have to try to stand up for others who are more vulnerable, but that we ourselves will be fine. The last two words I only say in my head. For now. So you see that? The fascism she's worried about is the fascism that affects other people. She knows she's going to be fine, but she's freaking out on everyone else's behalf about something that hasn't happened and never will happen. She's doing that on the basis of other things that have happened and is exploiting those things for political power, which kind of means she doesn't care about those things either. It really is all bullshit. It really is just a show. It's just strange that she's so panicked. Kind of makes you wonder what her husband is doing for Kamala Harris. Now, speaking of panic, we've talked for a couple years about the long-term ongoing freakout over the potential for the death penalty to come back into common use under the next Trump administration. The thinking being that the people who have committed crimes against America and crimes against humanity may well have to pay the ultimate price, which is the sentence their crimes demand. Maybe that's coming in the future. Maybe it isn't, but the law should be followed. And if that scares people, those people might be scared because they know they've broken those laws. I said we'd come back around to Liz Cheney. Here we are. For the last couple of months, Tucker Carlson has been doing his live tour with various guests. Last night, Donald Trump was one of his guests. Tucker interviewed him for about an hour and a half, and some of Trump's comments have caused quite the controversy. Aaron Rupar posted this last night on X, formerly Twitter.
And I don't blame him for sticking with his daughter, but his daughter is a very dumb individual, very dumb. She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face.
Rupar quoted Trump as saying, let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her. Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. And immediately people took that as Donald Trump says Liz Cheney should face a firing squad. Now, we're going to have to see just how high Liz Cheney's complicity in all of this rises. Maybe it is treason. But the law can handle that if that's the road we go down. We can cross that bridge when we come to it. But that's not actually what Trump was saying when you listen to it in context. And the National Pulse, as they covered this, highlighted the word Rupar in Urban Dictionary, a website that defines slang terms. The term, named after Aaron Rupar, is a verb that means to purposely mislead, to completely mischaracterize a statement or video by omitting context. And that out-of-context video was an example of getting Rupar'd. Here's a fuller context.
I don't blame him for sticking with his daughter, but his daughter is a very dumb individual, very dumb. She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face. You know, they're all war hawks when they're sitting in Washington in a nice building saying, oh, gee, let's send 10,000 troops right into the mouth of the enemy. But she's a stupid person. And I'd have meetings with a lot of people, and she always wanted to go to war with people.
Trump is simply making the point that it's awfully easy to be a war hawk knowing that you'll never actually fight in a war. And it's especially easy knowing that you'll never have to fight in the war and that your family will profit enormously. That's the point he's making. It's a point everyone who listens to that in context would realize and agree with. Hell, Bob Dylan would agree with that. What Donald Trump said is basically the theme of Dylan's song Masters of War. Maybe they're going to have to change the definition of the word rupar to include that it is misleading and mischaracterizing through the manipulation of video that ultimately causes a Streisand effect. All we need is the full context. All we need is to shine a little light on it. Thank you so much, Aaron Rupar, for helping us do that. It turns out that your democracy thrives in darkness. It only thrives in darkness. Your democracy dies in the sunlight, like any vampire. I'll be back on Monday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com, and for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon, down on the range.